Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wood at Work 2020, our 6th annual gathering to celebrate, explore, and examine the role of wood in connecting cities to forests and in co-creating sustainable environments. I'm Scott Francisco, one of the founders of Wood at Work and Cities for Forests. It's so great to see everyone here, and we have an amazing day ahead of us, a fantastic panel this morning, and so many good friends, colleagues, and fellow travelers in this room. As we've done in years past, I'm going to kick us off with a poem. This is called Essay on Wood by James Richardson. At dawn, when rowboats drum on the dock, and every door in the breathing house bumps softly, as if someone were leaving quietly, I wonder if something in us is made of wood. Maybe not quite the heart, knocking softly, or maybe not made of it, but made for its call. Of all the elements, it is happiest in our houses. It will sit with us, eat with us, lie down, and hold our books, themselves rustling woods, bearing our floors and roofs without weariness. For unlike us, it does not resent its faithfulness, or question why, for what, how long. Its branches have slowed the invisible feelings of light into vortices smooth for our hands, so that every fine-grained handle and page and beam is a woodward, a standing wave, years that never pass, vastness never empty, speed so great it cannot be told from peace. Wood at Work is a community of practice that links sustainable urban building, forest conservation, and global supply chain reform to build healthy cities while protecting the world's life-sustaining forests and the people who rely on them. Our multidisciplinary group, that's all of you, includes world leaders in architecture, city planning, anthropology, forest ecology, and sustainable forestry. Our conferences in New York, Montreal, and Toronto over the past 6 years have always integrated these disciplines, and that is really core to our mission, is to bring these voices and perspectives and research and experience together into one place to solve problems and build relationships. A few logistics to get us started. We have a great day planned with a morning session. We'll talk about the panel in a minute, and then in the afternoon we have a session on co-creating the Sustainable Wood for Cities guidelines together. We have Paul Bodie joining us to support the technical side of things from Centre Saint-Jacques here in Montreal. And you can email Paul or reach out to him on the chat at any point if you have any problems with the technology. We're going to be using the chat features, some polls, and some breakout rooms. So stick with us. And again, if you have any issues, please reach out to Paul. I hope everyone will join us for the second session. And we'd just love to have you work with us as we create this guidelines package for cities to really help guide their sustainability decision-making around wood. I'm also going to start with a quick and very deep thanks to our team who's made all of this happen. That really includes many of you here gathered, but I especially want to thank our core team at Pilot Projects Design Collective, Dr. Sarah Wilson, Mac Phillips, Sophie McCallum, and Caledonia Wilson. I also want to thank our friends at Grimshaw Architects, Aaron Vaden-Yeomans and Augustin Savage. Oops, excuse me. And just fix my slide share here. There, is that better? Great. From Trilox, Alexander Bender, Ellis Eisenberg, and Liz Zink. Paul Fugue of Naturally Durable, and Jeff Spiritos at Spiritos Properties. All of us have been working together, collaborating over the past year on some of this core work under the Sustainable Wood Specifications Working Group. I also want to thank our colleagues from WRI who we get to work with every day under the Cities for Forests umbrella, and under which this work is also being crafted. Todd Gartner, James Anderson, John Rob Poole, Paige Langer, and Francis Seymour. Thank you, all of you. Most of you know that I could go on and on about the awesome work that each one of you are doing, and instead I want to talk for a minute about what connects us. And this is especially important given how we've been disconnected by this pandemic that we're experiencing. And it's an extension of how in some cases our work can disconnect us by putting us on divergent pathways, sometimes for very good reasons, but all the more it's really important to reboot to the foundation sometimes, I really believe. What I believe about everyone that I know in the room here, and that's most of you, is that this is a group of incredibly motivated, talented, disciplined, hardworking, and influential people who have committed their life's work to sustaining the ecological and social systems that are allowing all of us to survive and thrive now and in the future. If we all thought of ourselves as a true team right now, behaving as a team with trust, a common purpose, and a common goal, I dare say that we might be considered unstoppable. There are a couple of well-used terms that I want to lean heavily on right now to set a course for the day and for our futures. Those are collaboration and systems thinking. In particular, I want to suggest that these can and must be thought of as one thing. Now, this could be a long lecture, and instead I'm just going to throw out a few ideas for us to chew on for the day. To start with, that the systemic challenges we're dealing with are the apex of complexity, systems complexity, and that we are meeting these with perseverance and imagination. And only through collaboration are we going to rise to the level of these systems challenges. One of my favorite systems thinkers, Donella Meadows, has a fantastic quote for us. A system is an interconnected set of elements, things, people, ideas, whatever, that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something, a function or purpose. This is what we must become if we are to adequately address the challenges in front of us. And I hope that Wood at Work this year can be a small part of making that happen. Without further ado, I want to introduce the panel. This panel has emerged in conversation over the years, and especially in the last months and weeks, on the topic of wood in long life construction and the carbon profile of wood. The general question that initiated this panel is about how we can best use, how we can best create a carbon profile, an environmental profile for wood as it arrives on the building site that incorporates all of the system's interactions and interdependencies. The general premise is that we are increasing the proportion of wood biomass in long life buildings, and that this may be an essential part of a climate response in an urbanizing future. Wood is a renewable building material. It can store atmospheric carbon for centuries. It may be less carbon negative, less carbon intensive on a volume or mass basis than other building materials. And wood consumption has an impact on forests that can be positive or negative. Demand for wood, increasing demand for wood, may result in clearing forests temporarily or in some cases permanently. These forest impacts can have very large carbon impacts in both short and long term, via wood waste, decomposition of the wood waste, loss of sequestration potential in the forest, soil carbon loss, or conversely, more effective forest conservation or community forest stewardship. So the question for the panel is that what are the three most important systems components, elements, relationships, feedback loops, et cetera, that will define the carbon profile of wood in the coming decade? I'm going to read the names of our panelists. We have Galina Churkina, Chad Oliver, William Keeton, Peter Pinchot, and Tim Searchinger joining us today. So some brief introductions to the panel. Galina Churkina is a visiting scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where she works in the group Forest and Ecosystem Resilience. Her research focuses on identifying sustainable pathways of urban growth, which among other things has led to a better understanding of the carbon cycle. And as many of you have read, her recent paper, Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink, published in Nature Sustainability, a fantastic paper for our community. William Keeton is a professor of forest ecology and forestry with the Rubenstein School at the University of Vermont. His research interests include forest carbon management and sustainable forest management policy and practice. He's researched and written extensively on the carbon dynamics of old growth and primary forests. Tim Searchinger is a research scholar at the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment at Princeton University and a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute. His work focuses on how to feed a growing world population while reducing the environmental consequences of agriculture. Some of his recent work focuses on the land use dynamics of increased global demand for timber. Chad Oliver is in phased retirement from Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He served as the Pinchot Professor of Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as the director of the Global Institute of Sustainable Forestry. And his most recent book is titled Global Resources and the Environment, which is a fantastic text for all of us here, co-written by Fatuma Arif Oliver. I'd highly recommend that book to all of you. Peter Pinchot is the CEO and founder of Whole Forests. For more than 15 years, Peter has worked with communities in rural Ecuador to develop sustainable forest management systems. His company harvests trees at a sustainable rate in the Chaco forest in northern Ecuador in order to produce beautiful and valuable wood products. His work focuses on combating climate change through forest conservation and green building. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Galina Churkina to kick us off with your answer to the panel questions. And this will be followed by a very participatory discussion amongst panelists and to involve the whole room. So thank you, Galina. Please take it away. Welcome, Galina.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Is the sound okay? Okay.
Yes, it is.
So I have actually two hats on my head. One is at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the other one is from the Nature Conservancy. So there is more than one. And today I will be addressing basically the question how to make the transition to timber cities sustainable. It's not yet a complete story, obviously. There is, I basically will provide some food for thought, addressing also the question that Scott just mentioned about the carbon profile in the future decades. So let's start with forests, and because this is basically that provides essential resources for this transition to the timber cities. And basically what we know about the forests, that in the past decades, they were providing the major carbon pump. So then as a kind of globally, we currently emit around 11 gigatons of carbon per year, but not all of it is actually stays in the atmosphere. Only 4.6 gigatons stays in the atmosphere, but the rest is absorbed by ocean, 2.5 gigatons of petagrams of carbon, and the land ecosystems, which is basically mostly forests. So where does this carbon end up? So the recent study showed that globally, in the first decade of the 21st century, the regrowing stands, forest stands, were absorbing actually and were responsible for most of the sink. And these regrowing stands were mostly located in the temperate latitudes. The old growth forests were also sequestering a substantial amount of carbon. These are the forests in the tropical regions, but also in the boreal forest, especially in the Russia. And the reasons behind this growth, I mean, the first, of course, the regrowing stands, they regrow and they absorb carbon. But in addition to that, the drivers behind this carbon uptake, increased carbon uptake, is the increased concentration of CO2. So the increased CO2 concentrations basically act as a fertilizer so that forests uptake more carbon, and they uptake it faster. Also, in some regions, deposition of nitrogen is also important because usually the natural forests, they are limited by nitrogen for their growth. So the question is, are these trends that we currently observe in the forests and this green pump actually proceed in the future? There are definitely some events like the forest disturbances that are associated with climate change that are counteracting this pump of carbon in the forests. So if you look just at the North America in between 2005 to 2008, basically the studies show that the droughts killed around 1.2 million hectares of forest in the southwest of the North America, and beetle outbreaks were killing 6 to 7 million of hectares per year, but that was mostly in the northwest. So these rates of forest mortality, they were actually comparable to the global deforestation rates. That is, I think, around 5 million of hectares per year. So this, the forest disturbances, I mean, also, I mean, we can add fire to this potentially too. They release carbon back to the atmosphere. And there are predictions that these disturbances, they will be more intensive and more frequent in the future. So in addition, so what happens in the future with the forest green pump is not so really yet, we are not so sure what will happen. Sorry, there is something. Okay. So then, in addition to carbon that the forests emit and also uptake, the forest also affect climate in other indirect ways. And this include not only CO2, as I said, but also emissions of nitrous oxide, methane, volatile organic compounds. Also, any changes in the extent of forest cover will affect the albedo, that is basically the color of the Earth's surface, and that will also change the energy balance together with the water fluxes between land and the atmosphere. So all this complex feedbacks between forests and climate, we have to keep in mind if we think of this green forest pump. So any kind of management activities that we suggest, especially large scale afforestation or deforestation, that's hopefully not the case, they will affect also all these variables and potentially will affect climate in addition to whatever we do with the carbon pool in the forests. So there was only one study that was taking into account most of these feedbacks, not all of them. And that was focusing on Europe and on European forests. And basically the group of scientists looked at the different management scenarios for European forests and how they affect the climate. And their conclusion was that basically there were trade-offs involved in any kind of management strategy they would implement in Europe for their forests. And their conclusion was that adapting European forests to future changes in climate would be the best strategy. And this adaptation should have basically the goal to provision wood products and other ecological services. So we need basically to monitor and manage this the carbon forest pump in the future. So that was about the forest that provide the resources. So the second part of the story is, of course, the manufacturing of wood products, and especially mass timber that is providing the construction materials for the buildings and for the timber cities. So the usual, the mainstream mass timber manufacturing facility is using basically high quality timber from forests, from natural forests or from plantations, and converts it into the products, CLT, glulam. It could be all kinds of other wood products that go into the buildings. And whatever is not used for these wood products will go and be burned, or it can be burned at the manufacturing facilities, or actually can be also sold and used as biofuels. There are, of course, exceptions. I'm talking about the mainstream manufacturing. So what I propose here is that basically this practice has to be so that the manufacturers of wood and wood products have to diversify their inputs, and they have to look at the kind of trends in the forest in the future and how forests change with climate change. So they will have to use more inputs. So one of those I already mentioned, this basically the salvage timber. All these natural disturbances in the forest, they result in a lot of standing biomass that is actually dead. And very little of this, as far as I know, is actually harvested. And so then, and used in manufacturing of these products. Of course, there should be research, and I heard of some research that is going on this, but that's something, I think this is a resource in the future, and that has to be considered by manufacturers and also the suppliers of timber to those facilities, how to take advantage of this in the future. The second, I think, important resource that also should be considered is the timber that comes from the agroforestry systems. This may be not so relevant for the temperate latitudes, but in the tropical regions, I think these agroforestry systems that could be very important, and they would also take off some pressure on the land that is used for agriculture only. So you can basically grow timber and agricultural products on the same land and not compete for this. And finally, I think another sources of wood that I think the manufacturers should think of is used wood that comes from demolished buildings, and also the or reused wood, that the wood that can be reused. I think there is still a very little of this wood that is actually can be reused, and there is definitely potential for scaling up this market, especially as more buildings will be built with wood in the future. And the second source, I think, of wood that can potentially come from the cities is also the tree clippings. There are many actually cities that have trees that are annually clipped and trimmed and pruned, and there is a lot of actually wood that is coming from these activities. I've heard of some movements that are trying, with basically some groups that are trying to collect these clippings and find some markets for those. But it's not so easy. I think in Europe, at least, a lot of these clippings, of course, these are small parts. These are not big parts. They are burned and used as biofuels, unfortunately. And finally, I think also, I propose that not only the inputs to the manufacturing of this manufacturing facilities should be diversified, but also the outputs. And they should not be limited only to the wood products and biofuels. I personally think that using this timber for biofuel is kind of counterintuitive, because what we want to achieve is actually that the carbon that is absorbed by trees, it stays on land. We don't want to release it back by burning. Basically, so if the parts of the wood that are too small to be used in some beams or columns, then it probably can be paralyzed and used converted into biochar that can be applied to the soils to increase the productivity of the soil, or also converted into product and kind of there is a new type of materials, construction materials, also that is made from the granulated biochar. Basically, the biochar is pressed together, and there is material that has carbon content of 90%, basically. So
Galina,
this is still kind of at the stage of development. I'm finishing.
Okay, we're a couple minutes over, so just and we'll look forward to coming back in the discussion.
Final slide. Yeah. So there are two basically take-home messages that the points of discussion that I want to present is that basically we need to adapt forests to the upcoming challenge, transition to timber cities, and also climate change. So we need to monitor and manage the forest carbon pump. And the second, I think also the adaptation of manufacturing facilities is needed, that they have to look at the diversification of inputs and outputs. So Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Galina. Great. We are going to change the order a tiny bit. Tim Searchinger is going to present next, and Tim has a little emergency to jump away for a few minutes. So we're going to go next to Tim, and then Tim will rejoin us later. So Tim, if you are ready to share your screen, we'll jump right into your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does everyone see my, here, wait a second. Everyone see my screen, my slide?
Yes, if you go to presentation view, then it'll be full screen.
Yeah.
Great,
Okay.
perfect.
So I'm going to try to be super fast. The basic question is whether harvesting wood, or when does harvesting wood for construction material actually kind of benefit from a climate perspective? And so this is kind of a model that we've developed, but it's not dissimilar from a lot of other models that look at this type of stuff. And so if you start with one, kind of the counterfactual is you basically leave the wood in the forest. You imagine a middle-aged forest that continues to grow for a while and accumulates carbon. And if instead you cut it down and the forest regrows, you get this kind of carbon stock from the forest regrowth. And then you add the fact that you have slash wood that starts, you leave it there originally, but it decays over time. You have wood that is stored in the product that you use. And this, of course, is a key factor, is what percentage. If you have, these are the percentages that we have developed from kind of typical uses of wood. So it's not necessarily the ideal use of wood. And you have, some is basically burned quickly, some goes into paper, short-lived products is basically paper, and then maybe 30% goes into construction. Then you have the material that goes into long-lived products displaces other material, concrete and steel, and you get a benefit from that. And here we're using a substitution factor that's kind of a mid-range estimate, or actually the kind of average estimate that's come of 1.2 to 1, which means for every ton of carbon in the wood, you save 1.2 tons of carbon in concrete and steel. But you see a lot of numbers that are a lot lower. For example, actually in the paper by Churkina that was mentioned, I think it's more like 0.5, but this is 1.2. And then over time, wood gets thrown away. Here we're assuming it goes into a landfill, and then you kind of get some storage, but some decay in the landfill. And in this case, in this kind of average example, the actual carbon implications are that it's negative for the environment, it's negative for the climate. And here, the key thing that we're doing, so this is kind of the overlay of what would happen if you didn't harvest the wood. And the key thing that we're doing is we're applying a 4% discount rate, which basically says we value mitigation that occurs earlier more than mitigation that occurs later. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and that can be debated exactly how much. But if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be so worked up about trying to stabilize the climate by 2050. And I think the general theory, if you can present this in simple language, is we're trying to buy time. We're trying to keep the climate from going too far out of whack while we develop the political will and the technology to be able to completely stabilize the climate. So we value mitigation earlier rather than later. Now that was an example where there's a net cost. Here's an example where you actually take a secondary forest, you convert it to a high yielding plantation, and then you use the wood for in the same ways, and you get a net gain. So it depends on your scenario from a pure carbon standpoint. And this will give you some, but let me just say, of course, when converting to plantations has a big biodiversity implication, generally losing about 50% or more of the species at least. People know that. But the numbers matter. So this was a paper by Chen et al., basically a kind of Canadian researchers, where they had different numbers. And in this case, 70% of the timber that's harvested gets into construction material. And they had a very, very high substitution value for concrete and steel. And if that's true, then Here you can get you don't really even have a payback period. You get a kind of immediate benefit for a structural panel. For lumber, it takes 21 years before you get a net greenhouse gas reduction. So it means you increased emissions in 21 years, and 39 years if it's a non-structural panel. So the point is that the numbers matter, and these are, I think, the critical parameters. So how fast does your forest grow, harvested or unharvested? A really, really big factor is what percentage of the wood gets removed from the forest. And then another really, really big factor is the percentage of that wood that actually gets into construction material. That was kind of key to the Chen results. And then how much concrete and steel is actually what the relative emissions. And I said, it's very hard to kind of track this down. The papers where people have been very specific about what they're doing, generally in the kind of 0.5 category, the Chen was more over 2. So that matters too. So let me just close by saying just a couple quick things. So in the Chen paper, they hypothesized that this would be beneficial even on a global basis if you could get all of their high levels of substitution and use, because they assumed you have a bunch of kind of managed forests in Canada that are well managed, well harvested, and that are not presently likely to be used for other wood products. So it's kind of like a surplus of well managed forests that you could then manage and harvest in a very high efficiency. And one question about that is there's another big issue, and that is, how are we going to meet all of the wood product demand? So we're basically looking, even without bioenergy or construction timber, at about a 50% increase in wood product demand by about 2050 from 2010. And it's uncertain, but a lot on a global basis. And that is a huge increase in demand. I think construction timber, if we use the numbers from Churkina, to get 50% of new urban construction would basically require about 50% more wood. And there was a wide range, but of possible numbers. But so then you're now in the doubling of wood product demand. And so the question, even then with that Canada scenario, isn't that wood already going to be needed to meet rising demand? So where do we actually find a way to get all that wood, assuming we can then have these scenarios like in the Chen where you've got this? And the last thing I'll say is that there are papers, a number of papers that do this calculation this way. The Canadians have generally done it this way. The overwhelming majority of papers that find benefits from construction timber simply don't count the loss of carbon in the forest. In effect, they're treating biomass as automatically carbon-free on the principle that it's kind of sustainable and renewable in the long run. And that is the same issue that's come up in bioenergy. And if you believe that, then it's also good just to harvest massive numbers of trees to burn them, or we shouldn't be recycling paper, this kind of stuff. So I do think that it's correct to count the changes in carbon in the forest because of the timing issue. But I do think that these key issues are important in terms of determining where we can actually, where we can get net gains. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tim. And are you going to be able to rejoin us for the panel discussion, do you think? I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions.
Yeah, I'll try later. Hopefully I can restrict everything else to half an hour, maybe back around 11:30. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. Great, thank you for that. Well, that was actually a great setup for our next panelist. We're going to go to Bill Keeton. So Bill, if you would love to just share your screen and take it away.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for the invitation to join you this morning. I'm thrilled to be here. Can you all see my screen?
Not your screen yet. We can see you.
Okay.
There we go. It looks like it's
How about
coming up.
that?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, great. So I'm going to address some of the questions that Scott posed to us, but I'm also going to take a slightly different approach. And I think that you'll find that my presentation is very complementary to Tim's, just maybe reinforcing some of the same concepts and adding a few others. So as I was thinking about this, I realized that I have essentially a number of tests that I would present in order to answer the question, do durable wood products and mass timber and timber frame structures create a net benefit for the environment, both for the climate and for other environmental concerns? So this is by no means comprehensive, but I'm just going to propose 4 things that I think about a lot. So the first is, if we produce durable wood products, and if we adopt that as a climate mitigation strategy, is that complementary or competitive with all the various other natural climate solutions that we're employing? Everything from reforestation and plantation forestry in some parts of the world, to conservation of high conservation value forests, high biomass, late successional old growth forests, other sorts of improved forest management strategies that are increasingly advocated by carbon markets. So are we reinforcing and complementing those other natural climate solutions, or are we competing with them through increased demand and intensification of forest management? So that would be the first question that I would want answered. And a big part of that is thinking about the full complement of carbon management strategies that we have available. It's not like this is a one-size-fits-all. We're talking about a portfolio of options, and we're talking about trying different things to spread the risk associated with any one of them. There's risk from a climate adaptation standpoint. There's a risk from incomplete knowledge regarding the carbon accounting. There are discount rates. There are a whole variety of risks associated with any one strategy. So we want to think about many. We can think about the 3 broad categories like reserve-based approaches, reforestation approaches, and improved forest management approaches, which is the field that I tend to work in the most. Innovative carbon silvicultural techniques that retain more carbon in the future, in the forest, and in some ways actually are conducive to growing higher quality, larger dimension trees, tightly grained, that create opportunities for high quality durable wood products. And so, we can think about a whole variety of different silvicultural systems that are coming online that are designed to do just that. And durable wood products, including mass timber, really fits here within this category. And so again, this test is designed to answer the question, are durable wood products complementary of these other strategies? Do they fit within the context of full carbon accounting and optimizing the mix of carbon strategies that we want to employ in the landscape? The second test has to do with carbon stocking, which Tim has already mentioned. And from a carbon market standpoint, and I'm not saying that carbon markets are perfect by any means, and we can really pick apart the protocol that they use and the baselines that they employ and all that sort of thing. But the one area of agreement that I would say that all the carbon market systems have, and that most scientists would agree to as well, that the sort of fundamental standard for carbon forestry is that if we're producing durable wood products, we also want to make sure that we're maintaining stable or increasing carbon stocking on the landscape. In other words, we don't want to produce wood products at the expense of the carbon storage that we already have, and then unwittingly flux carbon to the atmosphere. So what we want to be thinking about then is how we integrate production of durable wood products with the full range of carbon forestry techniques. This is just an example from one of my papers for the Northeastern US that we might employ to increase carbon stocking on the landscape. What you're seeing here on the x-axis is something like a continuum of timber harvesting options ranging from more intensive and higher frequency harvests, the type of practices that would be typically associated with high production forestry or industrial forestry, to less intensive harvesting practices that occur less frequently. So things like extended rotations and retention harvesting systems. A key element of this, by the way, also is just the concept of very efficient timber harvest scheduling. If we plan out our harvests very carefully over time and space, that's another way of increasing net carbon stocking on the landscape. And so the sort of fundamental litmus test then for a lot of carbon forestry is, is the suite of carbon forestry techniques that we're using either maintaining carbon stocking, the red dotted line, or even better, increasing the net carbon stocking over time. And then that difference is what we typically refer to as additionality. So if durable wood products fit within this framework, then we've passed that test. My third test is going to depart a little bit from the strict focus on carbon, because I think that these days we understand that carbon forestry needs to be part of the broader umbrella of sustainable forestry or multifunctional forestry. And by this, I mean really specifically that through exceptional forestry practices that produce high quality durable wood products, we're also producing other co-benefits that society demands and that nature requires. And of course, there are a million different co-benefits we could think about: biodiversity and hydrologic regulation and pollination services and open space and recreation, and the list goes on and on and on. I personally have been interested in a couple very specific co-benefits, such as open space conservation and conservation of core unfragmented blocks of habitat, important for wildlife, and then also co-benefits associated with very high quality stream habitats and flood resilience. And just a quick case study to show you that these types of co-benefits can be quantified and they can actually be mapped explicitly. We did this just recently in a study that I was involved with for the state of Vermont. I'm not going to belabor the details, but just really quickly to give you a sense of how one might approach the co-benefit question. In this case study, we were interested in identifying the actual privately owned parcels in the state of Vermont in the United States that would have the greatest potential for carbon projects, that would be most eligible, in this case, for voluntary carbon markets, where one might aggregate multiple parcels into a larger carbon project and then employ those types of carbon forestry techniques I was referring to a minute ago. So we mapped out, or we used a layer representing the forested area in Vermont. That's this. We overlaid a map that ranked parcels based on their flood resilience contribution, their whole variety of criteria that went into this. And then we picked just the top ranked parcels in the 20th top percentile in terms of flood resilience rating. That's this. And then we overlaid those on the core or unfragmented forest blocks that have been mapped statewide. We buffered this a little bit. And then from this, we mapped the parcels that, again, would be most eligible, most suitable for carbon forestry, but that would also provide these other very important co-benefits to the state. And again, in particular, those were open space conservation and flood resilience. So one can integrate carbon forestry with really explicit mapping and quantification of these other co-benefits. So for me, that's the third test that increased production of durable wood products would need to pass. Are we complementing production of co-benefits, or are we competing with those? And there's a lot that we could get into in terms of how that might play out. And then with my last couple of minutes, my final test is, do durable wood products fit within an adaptive framework? In other words, if we increase production of durable wood products, does that help make our forests future adapted? Will they be more resilient to fire and wind and ice and other disturbances that we're seeing more of and that we're increasingly concerned about? And of course, there are many, many ways to approach the question of adaptation and resilience. Here's just one based on a recent paper that my lab had. And this catchy little headline here that appeared in a number of journals: older forests resist climate change better. Obviously a simplification, but let me try to explain quickly how this works. So we used US Forest Service forest inventory and analysis plots from the hemiboreal ecotone of Eastern North America. That's where temperate forests grade into boreal forests across the US-Canada border. We used 18,500 plots, so this was a big data exercise. We took those data and we applied some very interesting Bayesian statistical models. Those were fed through the University of Vermont's supercomputing cluster. It took several days to run the computations, and here's the way it all came out, or sugared out, as we would say in Vermont. So we have these carbon projections associated with forest age and development. That's the first calculation. We were interested in co-benefits or ecosystem services like timber growth and timber production opportunity. That's the next calculation. And then we looked at how those things would co-vary with habitat provisioning for a variety of different biodiversity indicators. So we used a variety of different taxa to get a handle on biodiversity outcomes. And then we basically standardized all those or set them to an equal scale. We then looked at how those would play out under various climate change scenarios. And then in the end, we get this final panel that's a little bit tricky to explain, so I'll make a quick attempt at it now. What you're seeing here is basically how well the current mix of ecosystem services holds up under climate change. And we're sort of asking the question, will future forests with climate change provide the same ecosystem services now that they're providing now, or a different mix? And what we're seeing is that with climate change, the mix of services begins to break down. Forests of different ages start providing different services than they are now. So this is really important. If we're thinking about producing durable wood products over the next 100 years, is that consistent with the other services that we want from the landscape? Or will it compromise things like carbon sequestration and carbon storage objectives? What we did find is that in general, the older forests seem to be more resilient in terms of maintaining the same mix of ecosystem services that they're providing now. So again, I would want to know, do durable wood products, help us maintain structurally complex older forest structures that are providing the mix of services that we require, or are they interfering with the ability of forests to adapt and remain resilient in the face of climate change? And I'm not saying that the answer is one or the other. I'm just saying that that is the test that must be passed. So those are the 4 tests that I have for durable wood products, and I would be happy to discuss those a little bit more later today.
Awesome. That is fantastic, Bill. Thank you so much for that great presentation. And without further ado, we're going to go to Chad Oliver. And I'm just excited by the way these presentations are already interlinking and presenting different viewpoints, and it's going to be great to get the discussion going to connect everything together. Chad, are you able to share your screen? Great, you can see it there.
Okay, can you see that okay?
Yep, it's coming through beautifully.
Okay, sorry, I want to go back. All right, one thing I want to bring up is, first of all, congratulations to Scott and to the other speakers on some excellent presentations so far. I'm looking forward to this. What I want to emphasize, just I want to get my timer so I don't go over. Okay, what I want to emphasize is that we've made a lot of progress in terms of information about wood products and technologies that we can make plenty of use of to make sure that our environment and our wood is much more useful. One thing that's very important here is that beginning actually in the 1970s, but then reconstituted in the 1990s, was a group of institutions that started looking at life cycle inventory and then life cycle analysis relative to greenhouse gases for wood products. That's 28 institutions. It's been around over 20 years. They have basically an awful lot of information on the use of wood and the different pools that wood carbon can be stored in, including the substitution for steel and concrete. This is something very important. What this shows, for example, is such things as the amount of carbon embedded in, for example, a wooden I-beam versus a steel I-beam, and also the amount of emissions it takes to create each of these, what we call the avoided emissions. They do this for different products, and I want to show you just a quick example of some of these products. On the left, you see the comparison of a steel floor beam versus a wooden I-beam. The white at the bottom shows the carbon embedded in the wood itself. The gray is the amount of CO2 saved by avoiding the production of steel by using wood. And then the very top I can get to a little bit later. Now, notice that different products have different amounts of avoided steel and concrete emissions. The wooden beam versus a steel beam right in the middle is probably about where CLT would be. CLT has other advantages relative to a small footprint, but I want to use these quite important to show the importance of avoided emissions. And this is based on all of that quorum data. Now, there's a big question: if we begin to use too much wood, are we going to end up with basically eliminating our forests? Well, according to FAO data, which began in the 1970s, I believe, and this is the most recent, that basically we're right now using about 20% of the wood that is growing in the world. So conceptually, on a whole, we could use a lot more wood before we need to get to the point where we need to worry about over-harvesting in aggregate. And we're also being very innovative about using different types of wood. The upper left is tropical wood for shipbuilding. The lower left is actually tulip poplar used in England. And the right is some of Peter Pinchot's tropical wood. Now, if we look at it not in aggregate, we see some places are increasing in their amount of wood and other places are decreasing in their amount of wood. So what we need to do is, what hopefully we will do is stop from having certain places become depauperate, or something that is similar to what Bill Keeton said. It's not just the amount of forest, but the condition the forest is in. If you're going to manage very intensively for wood, you would go through the open to the dense structure, harvest it, and go back to the open structure. We would be missing savanna forest complex and understory forests. And incidentally, each of these forests has value for biodiversity, for fire prevention, for water quality, and similar such things. Now, the issue is, how do we manage our forests in such a way that we maintain all of these structures, but also can provide the value of wood products to substitute for others in reducing our CO2? Now, a simple way to do it is to say, what if we simply assumed that nobody could sell their wood unless they provided all of these structures? But that's a bit of a costly thing. Let's look at it a different way. Remember that graph where I looked at the amount of carbon that you could save by using each of these types of wood products instead of their steel substitute. Now, this is some calculations I did, and I want to redo them. I sent them out for some review that haven't gotten back yet. But if we look at carbon credits at $18 a ton, then if we could sell carbon credits to builders to build out of wood, then the builder would get a tremendous savings, $400 per thousand board feet in some products, $200 per thousand board feet in other products. That's a tremendous amount. Now, if we could say that a builder could only get this carbon credit if he bought wood from a forest that was certified to have all of the different structures or sustainable forests or what other sustainability constraints we wanted to put on it, then we would have a case where we would guarantee that in order to harvest this wood, the forest would not become depleted either in structures or in total volume. And the presumption here is that some of this savings by the builder would be passed on to the landowner to convince him to manage to sell his forest and to manage his forest. Now, another technology that we have is the ability to be able to plan so that our forests will always be sustainable on multiple values and to inspect that. For example, I'm almost out of time. Basically, we now have satellite imagery that can then give us forest inventories of a specific area. Those specific inventories can then be related to values from timber volume, carbon, fire risk, habitats. Those can be projected over time, so we can come up with a plan showing these multiple values. There are several programs that can do this. I will be able to do it within a year or two, including one that's open source by the United Nations. I've been working on as the University of Washington, the UNDP, and the Turkey. That'll be open access, open source. Now, once we have these types of forests that are under control, and we could have a certifying agency inspect them by looking at what we project, then taking a new inventory at that time of projection and determining whether we have hit our target or not hit our target. The result is that we can take the natural advantages of wood, sell the carbon credits for it to ensure that only landowners who are providing our other sustainability values are able to sell and get the carbon credits. And this would basically fuel a lower price of wood buildings, which would mean more wood construction, which would mean more carbon savings. And it would be a way of ensuring that we do not deplete our forests, because these carbon savings are only forests that can be shown not to be depleted, and that we maintain all of our different habitats. This is very quickly, but I hope this is helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chad. That was wonderful. This is amazing to see how these are starting to fit together, and I'm really excited to get our conversation going after Peter's presentation to really find the commonalities and where these fit. So thank you very much, Chad and Peter Pinchot. Would love for you to share your screen and tell us about your work and research. Peter, we can't hear you in case you are speaking to us. I can see your screen though.
How about now?
We've got you. Great.
Okay, I work in a quite different context. We're trying to keep the forest there in the midst of rapid deforestation in Ecuador. And I've been working for 15 years in innovating a sustainable forestry supply chain, which could connect very threatened forest with a forest products economy that then connects to low carbon products. So we're trying to connect green building with tropical forest conservation to create an incentive to keep the forest there. And see if I can get this, there we go. So I'm going back in time to what happened in the United States, because it's very relevant to what we need to do in the tropics, I believe. We had a spike in our deforestation when the railroads came in and we connected the forest to markets. And in about 70 years, we ended up with about 1% of the eastern forest, initial eastern forest left, with a huge amount of carbon emissions, big impact on biodiversity, wildlife, rivers, etc. And then in the next century, the forest came back in the east, or at least about 50% of the forest came back in the east, with many different environmental benefits. And part of that story was that in that century, the last century, we created a vibrant forest products economy, which provided a large incentive to keep the forest there. Virtually every forest in the United States is connected to some sort of a market which justifies managing the forest and keeping that forest intact. The question is, can we take that model and apply it to the tropics, where forest products infrastructure doesn't really exist at this point? And I've got to learn how we advance. Why is this not advancing? There we go. So this is the an image of where the high biomass forest carbon is in tropical forests. And there is in the Amazon basin, Central Africa and Southeast Asia, about 375 gigatons of carbon. And if we were to follow the US pattern and basically get to zero native tropical forest, it would be impossible to get to 1.5 or even 2.50 trajectory in climate change. So we know that we have to chart a different course in the tropics. The question is, how do we do that? And still having a hard time. There we go. Okay, this is where we operate in the coastal plain of Ecuador. The dark green is still intact native forest. The yellow is community owned, somewhere between degraded forest and small scale agriculture, and the white background is deforested. So 40 years ago, this was all forest. This is how rapid deforestation is occurring in lots of places in the tropics. We manage to operate in a 50,000 hectare watershed. We estimate that's around 10 million tons of carbon in that area. How can we keep that carbon there? So first thing you got to understand is how deforestation happens. These are very diverse forests. Only a few species in these forests have good markets. The rest has very low value. Logging companies put roads into the forest. They take out a few of the few commercial quote unquote species. At that point, the forest has very low value. You've now opened up the forest to agricultural markets, global and regional. And it's in the landowners, whether it's an indigenous community or a smallholder community, it's in their interest to knock the forest down and convert it to agriculture, because they can make a lot more money and they can send their kids to high school and they can go to the doctor, etc. So deforestation is a logical consequence of the lack of a market for the standing forest. And you end up with cattle pasture and crops like African oil palm. So we've constructed over these years, we constructed a new forest products economy in these communities that we're operating in with, and we have to understand that there are a few empty forests in the tropics. Communities live in the forest. If we want to do anything about the forest, we have to work and partner with the communities. So we've created a community forestry enterprise. We're implementing forest governance through 20-year lease contracts with each smallholder family. And in there, we do very light scale timber harvest. So we're only taking 3 to 5 trees per hectare every 20 years. We don't build roads in the forest. If you do that, agriculture comes in and you can't control the forest. We
Hey,
solve
Peter, sorry to interrupt. Someone's phone is going in the background. I don't know if it's on your side or in someone else's unmuted mic, but it's, I don't want to miss a word that you're saying. So
it could be me.
Thank you.
We do not build roads into the forest. Instead, we take portable sawmills into the forest, small diameter cables to take the wood out. And that way we can keep the agriculture from moving into the forest. And we design products that utilize the majority of species. We manufacture everything within the forest community, so we're creating lots of jobs. We've moved the people who we're employing from $2,000 a year average family income up to $11,000. It's a significant increase. So we're creating a forest products culture and economy that can create an alternative to deforestation. So our next step is to connect these forests to good markets. We market in the United States to green building projects. We're getting FSC certification and verified carbon certification through VCS this year. We do an LCA, which includes the forest carbon that's in the forest, and then we translate that into the amount of forest carbon we're protecting in the area that sourced the product, and we add to our products a carbon offset. It's not a formal carbon offset because in Ecuador you can't sell carbon, but it's a carbon credit benefit to the project. So for instance, 1,000 square foot flooring, we're going to find out exactly when we get our certification. We estimate it'll be somewhere between 20 to 25 tons of carbon that we're saving in the forest associated with that product. So it's a very carbon negative kind of product. We think this may be a way to transform how we manage tropical forests, not waiting around for a big carbon market to open up, but just integrating the carbon benefit into our project. So there's one sale, which is just the sale of the product. So that's how we're approaching creating a forest product economy that creates the adequate incentive to keep the forest there. And that's it.
Wow. Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. I am just amazed at the work that everyone is doing and also the amount of commonality that I'm seeing coming out of these 5 presentations. So what we're going to do for a few minutes is I'm going to sort of moderate a little discussion amongst the panelists before we open it up to the whole group, and probably we'll just do this for sort of 5 or 10 minutes because as usual, presentations always take a bit longer than you think, and I want to leave plenty of room for the conversation from the room. So I would just say for all of you out there in the room, if you have specific questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm not sure if we'll quite have our fingers on that. We're just going to go out and start asking questions, and we'll call on people as judiciously as we can when we get there. So I'm seeing some themes emerging that I just want to put to the panel and see if we have sort of agreement on these themes that are connecting the work. One theme that I think has come up in almost everyone's presentation is that we have to look at the suite of alternatives, right? That we can't just focus on one approach to doing something, but we have to be able to back up and say, what if we didn't do this? What if we did this a different way? And that the comparison of approaches is a critical way of understanding the real benefits when it comes to climate and the other benefits. I think you've all brought that up in one way or another. That includes, for example, alternatives regarding building materials, like if we build with wood, if we build with a different material, but that's a kind of a small subset. If we leave the forest standing untouched, if we harvest it in one way or another. So that sort of idea that we have to really be able to digest and measure those kinds of alternatives. Another theme that I'm seeing across all of the presentations is that forest management matters a lot, that the different strategies and applications for managing the forest are absolutely fundamental to what the outcomes and benefits would be. That the use of the wood itself matters, and that sort of rolls up to the first point a little bit, that if we're making short-lived wood products, we're getting a very different outcome than if we're using wood in long-life products. And so that becomes something quite interesting to all of the designers and strategists who are sort of looking at the kind of the demand side of where wood goes. I'm pretty sure that everyone mentioned that fact as well. These are not actually in order. So forest structure matters. That's really kind of a subset of the idea of management, that we can't think of forests as sort of a generalized thing. We have to think about forest structure. And as Bill brought up, that that's very much a regional thing as well. And the idea of climate resilience is something that we have to be able to project into the future and see if what we're doing now is going to have different kinds of consequences 5, 10, 25 years from now. And that markets matter. And Peter, you made this point very directly, but I think everyone sort of hinted at it, at least, that if we don't develop markets that support these kinds of approaches, management techniques, then we very well might not be able to support even our best ideas. So the idea that the global markets can, and I would like to say must, become a player in supporting these different strategies is really important. So that would apply to all of these issues about, so Chad, you brought it up that if the market is there for builders, for example, to benefit by selecting wood products that come from a particular forest management practice through certification or otherwise, then that changes the whole picture. And I mean, you can link that directly to what Peter was saying. You're doing that at a very particular scale, but your approach really scales to the whole global suite of wood products. So maybe I'll pause there, and if each of the panelists would like to make just a minute or two of comments, maybe some things that they've seen, either responding to what I've just said or even just directly to what they heard in the other presentations, that would be great. And anyone can just jump in. If you want to, you can all unmute your mics, I think, at this point, and or just selectively mute and unmute whenever you want to speak. Well, Bill, I see you're unmuted, so I'm going to just go to you. You're nodding. What some takeaways that struck you from the other presentations, and maybe how we're going to focus on, start with where they're connected. So what do you see as commonalities on some of the other presentations?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I was nodding because I was thinking about what you just said and how much I agree with you. I felt like there was a lot of commonality and overlap among the talks, which was exciting to see. You've already touched on these, but for me, highlights were that net effects on carbon stocking on the landscape are critical. And that's kind of like the first fundamental test that has to be passed. And I feel like all of the talks touched on that in some way. And this is important, as Tim and others mentioned, because if we see a significantly increased demand for wood in order to supply the demand for wood frame structures, that could put real pressures on the forests, and that could have the unintended consequence of reducing carbon storage on the landscape. So there's a real opportunity cost there, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen. And Dr. Oliver presented ways of monitoring that, and those sorts of jurisdictional red monitoring protocol are really important actually in this sort of thing. So that was an important point actually. So that was the first thing. And then, yeah, you're right. So the specific forestry practices that are used are important, because we don't want to see increased demand for wood products result in a shift to more intensified forestry practices, sort of production forestry systems that we've just spent the last 20 or 30 years trying to move away from a little bit in the field of sustainable forestry, to introduce ecological silviculture and management for biodiversity and ecosystem services and those kinds of concepts. So there's a potential conflict there that we want to try to avoid. So the practices matter. And then, you know, again, one way of approaching that, as you said, and I'm just reiterating, is that, you know, if we think about the mix of structures and the mix of habitat types that are maintained or created on the landscape, that's one indicator of how effective we've been. So those three things really emerged for me as kind of unifying themes from all the talks.
Thank you, Bill. And before I let the other panelists speak, I'm going to pivot that question slightly back to the rest of the panel, and that is, I guess the sort of big elephant in the room is, can we produce the quantity of wood that we're projecting we need with those kinds of sensitivities, right? So it's all well and good to say, well, you know, we can do this here and there, and there's boutique products that are available with that kind of either certification or beyond certification, the kind of work that Peter's doing. But can we supply the world's wood needs and this massive urbanization that we have barreling down on us with all the climate implications? Can we get there while maintaining those kinds of sensitivities? So maybe I'll put that question to Chad firstly, and then the rest of the panel as well. But please feel free to answer the other questions that I've already or your response to the other presentations as well. Thank you.
If you notice, actually in my graphs, the amount of carbon sequestered by different wood products varies dramatically. With something like engineered wood I-beams, saving a very large amount of CO2 if you use those instead of steel I-beams. However, a wooden stud does not save that much compared to a steel stud, because the steel studs, as somebody said, are about as thin as chewing gum wrapper, so they don't use much steel. The point here is that if you have a market mechanism so that if you ever begin to get a constraint on the amount of wood that you can sustainably harvest, then the market mechanism will dictate that you put the wood that you harvest into those products that will save you the most CO2. So that basically, if we start running low on wood, it would be better to take the existing wood and make wooden I-joists out of it rather than make wooden studs. So we have not only just kind of a sharp line of, yes, there is too much wood, or yes, there is too little wood, we have to stop using, or yes, we will, but we can actually shift toward, if we ever get to the point where in all of our different regions of the world, we have too little wood, we can start putting the wood where it will be most effective in avoiding CO2 emissions. And by also having this requirement on maintaining all structures on the landscape, if one region begins to get where they do not have enough wood under those requirements, we can shift the wood to some other region. So it basically doesn't have us where we denude the country before we do our best effort.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Paul, you have a question?
Or just a little technical intervention. I'm just going to suggest that everybody please switch to gallery view. Depending on your device, that button will be likely at the top right of your screen. It'll just be easier for us to see who wants to make a comment and what people's reactions are. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Scott, can I say something?
Of course, Jeff, please.
Thanks. I think your assembling this crew is incredible, and I'm learning so much, and I think there's so much to hear other experts of different industries contribute, and I'm just so excited we're on this subject. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think those in this group would say that sustainable harvesting practices is an underlying principle. We are far from there in the world, but that we need to be moving there in order to be able to, be maximizing the carbon stocking potential of what we're doing and not degrading. The second thing is that the major, challenge ahead of us is to stop using steel and concrete to the highest extent and use more timber, whether it's for studs or for mass timber. It just so happens that in building, if you're going to build traditionally these days, that's with dimensional lumber largely. And so that probably, Chad, doesn't, store that much carbon compared to its counterparts. But the opportunity is there to move towards more and more substitute mass timber use. And if our goal is to, as close to as possible, eliminate that 11% greenhouse gas emission from the building sector, then moving towards using the products that store the most carbon, and also, thankfully, provide many other benefits along the way, like living in a natural environment, for example, is the way to push.
Thank you, Jeff. And I should have introduced Jeff Spiritos for those who don't know him. Many of us do know you well, Jeff, as a leader in the mass timber advocacy and industry. Jeff is a developer, so coming from the kind of demand side of this, and also someone who's really encouraged and supported a lot of the work and research and practice in the East Coast especially. I had an idea, and Paul, I don't know, I see you struggling a little there with your keyboard, but is it possible to do a poll? And here's the poll, if it's possible to do quickly, if not, no problem. I'd love to know how many people here consider themselves kind of representing the demand side of this discussion, and how many people see themselves as representing the supply side. I know that's in a way a kind of very coarse-grained question, but it'd just be interesting. Demand side being if you're an architect, engineer, builder, someone who is basically creating the market, right, for the kinds of things that we're talking about. So Jeff, obviously you're a perfect example. You're on the demand side and you're out there preaching about reducing embodied carbon in buildings and how wood can be part of that. And a lot of the panelists were coming more from the supply side and looking at what are the impacts on the forest. And many people might say they're on both sides, and that's great. But if you're able to do that, anyway, let's keep the conversation going. Paul, if that's possible to set that up, that'll be a little test of our tech. So,
Scott?
Yes, please, Peter.
One takeaway from me out of this is that we do now, we're doing LCAs mostly from the timber through to the finished product through to end of life. And the impact on the forest is so specific that we really need to be doing the LCA from the forest in its particular circumstances and add that into the whole LCA. So that when you're looking at your environmental product declaration, sourcing your product, you look all the way back to the forest itself and not just back to when the timber comes into the manufacturing facility or the harvest. And that requires that you have chain of custody so you know where the product is actually coming from. And the other thing is that I'm wondering is if any of us are thinking about in our carbon evaluation and our forest management about adaptation to climate change as forests are degrading from the increasing climate change impacts, and how we factor that into thinking about these values. Because it may be that sometimes there's going to be times when we have to reduce the forest biomass in order to get the forest regenerating into the new species groupings that are going to be adaptive to that environment. So it's not, we're looking at a non-linear future with how we manage forests, I would think.
Is that a macro level forest management question? Bill spoke to that a little bit, but maybe you're talking about more of an intervention rather than, so Bill, if I understand what you presented, you're saying that the older intact forests have resilience built into them for adaptation and resilience to climate change, or maybe resilience, but adaptation might require something more aggressive, you could say. Is that what you're saying, Peter, that in order to make these changes?
Well, I'm thinking of when species, the climate changes so that the species is no longer adaptive to that, that set of climate conditions.
Is there anyone else in the group that wants to speak to that? Sorry, who is that?
I'd love to weigh in on this unless anybody else from the panel wants to.
Please.
Well, I appreciated Peter's comment very much, and I couldn't agree more. I just will say that the example I presented in that study where we showed the climate resilience benefit of older forests was just one example. And so we're not saying that that is the only approach. We're saying that that's one approach. But I think that we have very useful frameworks for adaptation these days in forestry, and we think about it in different ways. So there's the resistance, resilience, and transition, right? So one way is to manage forests that resist climate change. Another is to help them recover from disturbance and stresses better. That's resilience. And then the third is transitioning. So that's sort of what Peter was talking about, facilitated migration and that sort of thing, transitioning to that future forest. And it's really important that we don't think of any of this as a one size fits all, right? We need to employ all these strategies on the landscape, and it's going to take different forms in different parts of the world. So adaptation in fire-prone Western forests, where we need to do fuels treatment and prescribed burning, is completely different from adaptation in moist, temperate Eastern North American forests, right? And if we start thinking about where we're going to find and how we're going to produce large dimension timber for mass timber structures and other things, it has to fit within that framework. Is this part of resistance, resilience, transition? What does it look like depending on the part of the world that you're talking about? So
what are the management implications of you buying that piece of wood?
Exactly,
right?
So there's just a lot to dig into, and the detail matters. The devil's in the details.
I'm seeing so many faces that I'd like to hear from. Jean-Marc Dubois, you are representing one of maybe the largest mass timber manufacturer in North America. Certainly one of the preeminent leaders in the field. Do you have a couple words to say about this?
Yeah, actually, there were a couple of things that I heard, and shout out to Jeff. I didn't get a chance to say hi to you earlier, but it's good to see your face here, and everyone. It's really great to see a lot of old friends. But yeah, there were a couple of comments, and there's elements as far flung as albedo, which I was really grateful to have that shown on Galina's presentation. With regards to forestry, we're all dealing with the impacts of climate change, and we're all talking about our little niche products as they're impacted and how they can impact the big picture. So William's point about us having to do all of these things, I think, is essential. But just in terms of what we've noticed over the past decade, the climate change has become more prevalent. The ability for us to harvest in winter has been severely impacted due to longer warm seasons. We can't wait for the snow to fall in Chibougamau, where we're at. For those of you who don't know, we're a northern Quebec manufacturer. We harvest on what is currently the 11th largest FSC certified forest in the world. We're maintaining about 10 million acres of boreal forest that we're harvesting, and we're doing that through FSC certified processes. So we're making sure that we're ensuring more than 10% additional growth from what we're extracting. But just the changes that we've seen with the climate change, with the temperature gradient increasing, it has really impacted, even in the past decade, how our forestry operations are impacted and what that does to the mix of product that we have. So instead of going out into the frozen bogs and harvesting the black spruce that we have, that's very high value and that can be used in small sections in the I-joist that Chad was talking about, or in mass timber, we're harvesting balsam fir and jack pine, which are less optimal. They grow in the sandy soil and you don't have to worry about the bogs freezing over. So we'll go through these cycles now where the impact of that has a lot to do with the feedstock that we're getting for products. So, you know, we have a big problem that's not getting any better in the short term. But I think sustainable harvesting is one of the key elements there that we need to do. So,
Galina, I'm just wondering, you went first, so I'd love to come back to you if you have any responses to the other presentations or any of the questions that have been put forth, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Sorry if I could just cut in just for a second. Yep. For everybody, if everybody could, most people have not responded to the poll. If you could maybe just switch back to your Zoom screen, you might see a poll in front of you. And if you could respond to that, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Paul, I don't see, where am I supposed to click? Because I see the two bars, but I don't see the options for clicking on one or the other. Maybe I'm just missing something. So I don't know if others are struggling with that too. Do you just click on the bar itself, or I see supply and demand?
There's a dot next to the name.
It might be
maybe because I'm the host, it doesn't give me the option, but that's fine.
Exactly.
Okay. Right.
Paul, somebody also commented that we need to add a both to the poll, because some people aren't. Can you click both?
We're going to change the data now. All right. Galina, go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I would like actually to comment first on the last on the Jean-Marc's comments, and I think it's very interesting for me to hear that what scientists actually know from observations that actually some species are retreating to the north is actually now seen by people who harvest. Because I've seen a lot of studies basically showing these trends, but I wasn't sure how it is actually reflected in the industry. But obviously there is an impact, and I mean, but in this case, what Jean-Marc actually told us is actually this is you substitute one coniferous species by the other one. But what actually science showed that there is even more retreat of the midleaf trees to the north. So there will be more and more hardwood species that will be growing in the higher latitudes. So that's something that also, I guess, goes to the point that I was trying to make, is that the manufacturers of timber products should be looking for diversifying and their abilities to diversify inputs to their pool, to their facilities. And I mean, I was mostly talking about the different sources like the salvage timber or like agroforestry, or the like inputs coming from the cities. But I think that this ability of manufacturers to diversify the inputs to their facilities would also increase the resilience potentially in the future of what they can produce and the climate change conditions. Because although we are now happy with forests that are growing well and they absorb a lot of carbon, there is the climate, there's feedbacks between forests and climate, they are highly non-linear. So we cannot really assure that this will continue for the next, I don't know, 20, 30 years like this. So one has to prepare for surprises. And I really think that especially the investing some research and effort in using the timber from the salvage from this affected sites, by sites affected by bark beetle or the fires, for instance, that would be would be worthwhile doing. I don't know, maybe somebody who does the manufacturing could comment on that, because it would be interesting for me to get also the feedback on that, how feasible it is, or maybe it's already done.
There's a few, I know there's a few in the room, Galina, that can speak to that. I'm thinking of the folks from Trilox. I also met this morning Nicole Knobloch, and you're in a timber industry on the demand side. So I think just maybe a few from the floor to respond to how the demand side can be shaping those markets to bring diversified products from sourcing information to different streams of waste material reuse, urban wood waste, etc. Nicole, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. I'm not in the industry itself, but I am working to open markets for the industry, because I think ultimately it is a climate solution. And, you know, especially when we're looking at the need in our cities. I'm in the Boston area, but this is repeated all across the country, to increase housing while at the same time dramatically decreasing emissions. I agree with Jeff Spiritos. We can't just keep putting up concrete to make that housing happen. But I do want to say that while obviously we think that forest management is incredibly important and is going to be incredibly important to make this the right building material, we're at this place where we have to get developers just to take it up and take it up as a normal course of business, not as something that they're doing to be super duper environmental, but just the ordinary guy who's going to go out there and build a mixed use or multifamily housing unit, and he might be using light gauge metal or steel framing, that he might be incentivized to use mass timber. Even Chad Oliver was pointing out that flooring is an area where there's a lot of storage in the wood. In an LCA that we did, just substituting flooring in the buildings brings down the related carbon emissions quite a bit. So we're kind of at this chicken and egg place where I think the more we can stimulate the demand, we reason that we stimulate the demand like through public incentives for the climate benefit, that then we can drive some of the better forestry that we want to see. Here in New England, but for forest products, what we're going to see is development of our forests. I mean, that's our option. It's not necessarily to just have natural standing forests. So that's part of the complication of the mix is, you know, making sure the wood starts to get used, making sure that the forests are well managed, and connecting those two in a way that slowly over time brings up the use of wood in building materials, but also brings up the ecological awareness of what it means to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Paul, did you want to say something? Paul Few?
Yeah, I did. Just briefly, the New England forests have been experiencing a tremendous change in species that I'm not trying to say that it's all a climate discussion, but, you know, where ash is gone, butternut's gone, you know, there are a bunch of other trees that are no longer in the forest to any kind of reasonable degree. And so this, I think, is an area where there could be examination of what the forest product industry is doing about this in terms of their appetite for various species. You know, red oak is doing extremely well in the northeastern forests right now, so people are using it a lot. I'm really making a suggestion about a very dynamic situation that is worthy of study, and I think that information would also play into what to do with a forest that's close to a city. You know, the Cities for Forest, in developing plans that engage the imagination. And one other comment is that the COVID era has brought a renewed interest in parklands and escapes from the city and so on and so forth. And that is a messaging opportunity. You know, people are going out because they, you know, they're cooped up and so on, but they should be going out into an environment where they're being taught about the forest and taught about forest products and so on and so forth. And in some, it's just, we are, you know, there's dynamic situations everywhere, and they are all worthy of study from a product output point of view and a public relations point of view.
It sounds like we could say from all the comments and I think all the presentations that this linkage of supply and demand is absolutely critical, that building consumer awareness at all levels, that just in the way that we read ingredients on a food product, and we might get down to the 15th ingredient and we're still reading, we need to have that same kind of awareness of where our wood is coming from and what the impacts might be in order for the market to really take this up and become a participant in forest management. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I'm scanning the Patrick, love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I kind of have two specific questions, and I would like to ask, probably Peter or Chad will answer those questions. Number one, I would like to know if the timber products that we've touched on, for example, beam or flooring products, are they tree type specific? Like, for example, in my country, the most abundant trees are eucalyptus or silver oak trees. Are those, do those qualify for those types of products, or if we were to manufacture those products, we would have to replant trees specific for that? Number two, I would like to know, for example, climate-wise, again, I'm asking for my country, Rwanda, which is like in the tropics, they kind of have high humidity and it's constantly raining. How do we know that those timber trees would hold up over time compared to concrete buildings?
I can take a whack at the first question, which is that for things like flooring, there are customs of what species are appreciated and which ones are not so appreciated. So those are relative to aesthetic choices that go on. And for instance, when we tried to get into the Ecuadorian market for flooring, there was really one species that people wanted to have for flooring, which wasn't in our forest. We had beautiful species and nobody wanted them because they had and that's white oak right now is really in flooring in the United States. You can get it painted any color you want, and that's a dominant trend. Cherry flooring right now used to be in to some extent and is not so in anymore. So things fluctuate and they're very aesthetically driven for flooring. And yeah, I think that's as close as I can come to that. Chad?
Okay, a couple of things in terms of, let's see, specific tree species. There's two parts to it. Some species have certain particular values that others don't have. For example, a floor made out of radiata pine is so soft that it's not very good. Every time someone walks across it, you could follow their footprints almost. Whereas a hard species would be very valuable. So you have the actual use importance of one species versus another. A second thing is that the way you cut a particular log can make a difference. If you flat saw so that you get warps in the grain, it makes a floor that creaks when the weather is dry. If you quarter saw it, then you make a floor that is generally much less creaky and doesn't shrink and swell as much. So the way you cut it is another thing. The part of the tree is also valuable. The center part of a tree is often has more of a tendency to warp, has more knots, and is easier to break than the outer parts of the tree, which are stronger. The way you use the wood is important. Wood is generally much stronger in tension than it is in compression. This is why wooden I-beams are so strong, because you have the tension on the lower part of the beam, and you can build your structure according to that. The last part of this is the snob appeal. It used to be that especially a furniture industry had the philosophy that if they could see 10 years supply of a given species, they would create the demand for it. That's not exactly true in that some woods are just, you can't make a good quality out of a type of wood that's not very strong, but very weak anyway. But there are certain variations that you can create that basically goes along with what the market is.
Great.
Now, as for things like eucalyptus, maybe you can say this more, the rap on eucalyptus in Australia is that it was so warpy and twisted, intended to shrink and swell with such poor dimensional stability that it apparently wasn't very overly desirable. Now, people are using quite a bit of eucalyptus now, and I don't know whether that's because they have found glues to glue it in place a lot better, or whether they've actually done genetic work to improve the quality of the eucalyptus wood.
Right.
So the answer to your question is a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
How you cut the wood, where it is in the tree, what you're using it for. Another one is what climate you're in, because when you asked about your climate question, certain species shrink and swell well. Certain species are extremely resistant to rot by moisture.
Chad, sorry
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. We only have a few minutes left, and there's a few more questions. So I think that's a great kind of overview of the specifics of how different woods and different treatments of the woods can sort of notch into the market. And so we've got we've only got 2 minutes officially left. Amir had his hand up for a while. Thank you very much, Chad. Amir, do you have a question that you can pose in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. As an architect, I've been advocating for the use of, for increased use of timber in construction for quite a while. And so I've been on the side of driving up demand. So I was very happy to see all the studies that the panelists presented on, what the increased demand has on the forests. But I think one of the issues that we need to tackle as well is that buildings don't have an indefinite lifespan. And so eventually those buildings are going to be taken apart, and if we don't find a method or process to reuse that timber, it will again fall into the pile of decomposing matter that will eventually emit CO2. So I think that I'm not sure, maybe the panelists can answer if there are already studies being done on that. But I think as we start to analyze the trajectory of increased demand and increased use of timber products in construction, we have to think about the afterlife as well.
Thank you, Amir. And I think that was touched on a little bit, and I know there's others in the room that have special interest in studying this. Jim Hart and Francesco are both working on this topic. Tim Searchinger, you've joined us again, and I don't know if you have any very quick last words from your side to share before we break for a lunch break, which is technically right now, but we can stretch it out 1 or 2 more minutes.
Thanks. I'm sorry I had to miss, so I don't really have a whole lot of words.
Okay.
I'm sorry I missed whatever I missed, but I do. I mean, the one thing I haven't heard a lot. I mean, people have to be aware that we're facing a huge increase in wood product demand, independent of further stimulation for timber. I mean, for mass timber. And so part of the question is, you think about all of the changes you need to do to try to meet that wood product demand that's coming down, a lot of it due to growth of population and incomes in Asia. And so, the other question is like, where do you fit it all in? And I'll just flag that as an issue.
I do want to respect some break time, and so we're at that point right now. Are all the presenters willing to share their presentations? We can distribute those later. And this is being recorded, so everyone will be able to go back and review the conversation. The chat is also being recorded, and we'll find a way to package this up. So if you're putting things in the chat, questions that have not been answered, hopefully there'll be a way to bring this all together, and you'll be able to review everything, as well as get in touch with folks that have presented here. So the real point of this is to keep this conversation going, to be introduced to these different points of view and this different research, which is really the only way to build the conversation. So I think this has been a fantastic start. And I think we've developed some ideas of commonalities, and I think there's some emergent challenges here in how the market can specifically work with the challenges of forest management, whether it's species selection, whether it's the types of harvests that we're doing, and bring that to the consumer, so that when they're specifying a building, and that consumer could be you, Amir, and Shop Architects, who's been commissioned to build a building, and you're Jockey Mass Timber, and then it's, where does it come from? Well, you're going to go to Jean-Marc Dubois perhaps and say, hey, where are you guys getting your wood? And then it's sort of like, that's the chain, right? If you're asking and your clients are asking for something specific, you've got to find out where to get that. And so really that's where we're at with pulling all of this together right now. Sorry, now I'm rambling on. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep the Zoom open. Please don't close out of Zoom. Keep it open. You can turn your video and audio off if you like. Some of us are going to stay here. I'm going to just grab a quick bite and come back. So I'll be back here in a couple of minutes. And we can eat our lunch together at 12:15. A couple of minutes after, we're going to move into our second session, which actually is going to dig in to all of these topics that have been put on the table today in very practical terms, with a prototype of how a city can be that consumer, can be that discerning consumer. How can we empower cities and all of their partners to ask for the kind of wood that have been presented here? That is sustainable wood. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do you ask for it? Where can it come from? And we really want all of you to join us in that second half. We're going to be breaking up into small groups, testing our prototype, which is in very early stage, and see if it works, where it doesn't work, and build a better version of that. So we'll say a sort of a quick temporary goodbye. Again, keep your Zoom open and feel free to turn your mic on and interact, and we'll see how that goes. And everyone can join us again at 12:15 we'll leave everyone 15 minutes. So we'll say 12:17 for the next session. Thank you so much to our panel. That was phenomenal, and we'll see everyone soon.